On the morning of May the 26th, 2011, a hearse arrived at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx before the gates opened to the public. The woman inside had died 2 days earlier at the age of 104 in a hospital room she had occupied for 20 years, registered under the name Harriet Chase. Her real name was Huguette Clark. She was the daughter of one of the 50 wealthiest Americans who ever lived. She owned 3 mansions collectively worth more than $200 million. 40 servants maintained them. Fresh flowers were arranged in rooms no one entered, and not one of those houses had seen its owner in half a century. This is the story of the woman who had everything and chose nothing. Chapter 1: The Log Cabin and the Golden Eggs. In 1863, a 24-year-old Pennsylvania farm boy arrived in Montana Territory with nothing, and within 4 decades, he would control more wealth than most nations. His name was William Andrews Clark. He came from a family of Scots-Irish farmers in Connellsville, a town so small that its chief export was its young men. Clark had studied law for 2 years, taught school briefly, and decided that none of it would make him rich. The gold camps of the West were calling, so he loaded a wagon and headed toward the sunset. He did not find gold, not at first. What he found instead was something far more valuable: the willingness to do what other men would not. While miners spent their dust in saloons, Clark hauled eggs and tobacco to the camps and sold them at markups that would make a Wall Street trader blush. A single egg fetched $1, a pound of tobacco, $2. He understood before anyone told him that the real money in a gold rush belongs to the man selling shovels. By 1872, he had saved enough to buy his first mining claims near Butte, Montana. But Clark was not a gambler. He was a student. He enrolled at the Columbia School of Mines in New York City, spending a year learning metallurgy, geology, and assaying. He returned to Montana not as a prospector, but as a scientist. And this made all the difference. The timing was almost supernatural. Thomas Edison had just begun his experiments with the incandescent bulb. Alexander Graham Bell was stringing his first telephone wires. The country was about to electrify itself, and electricity demanded one thing above all others: copper. Butte sat on the richest copper deposit in North America. Clark had been buying claims for gold. He was sitting on a mountain of the future. He moved fast. He bought distressed mines from owners who did not know what they had. He built smelters to process ore that other men hauled to distant cities at great expense. He constructed a railroad to carry the copper to market. He bought banks to finance the operations and newspapers to shape the public narrative. He was not merely mining. He was building an empire vertically, controlling every step from the rock face to the rail car. Butte in those years was unlike any place in America. 30,000 people crammed into a town perched above tunnels that ran thousands of feet into the earth. The smoke from the smelters hung over the valley like a permanent fog. Men died underground with regularity. Fortunes were made and lost in a single season. But Clark did not lose. He had the education, the discipline, and the merciless instinct for acquisition that separated the merely wealthy from the truly rich. Within a decade, Butte had become the richest hill on earth, and William Andrews Clark owned more of it than anyone alive. The numbers were staggering. By the turn of the century, Clark's annual income reached $12 million. A doctor in those years earned $2,000. A factory worker, $600. Clark made in a single month what most Americans would not earn in 10 lifetimes. His fortune at its peak was estimated between $150 million and $250 million. a sum that in today's currency would rival the wealth of Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. He was the second richest man in Montana, behind only Marcus Daly, and the two of them despised each other with a hatred that would reshape American democracy. But wealth on that scale does something to a man. It does not simply change what he can buy. It changes what he believes he deserves. And William Andrews Clark believed he deserved everything. The Copper King had laid his golden eggs. Now he wanted the one thing money was supposed to guarantee: respect. He looked east toward Washington and decided that a seat in the United States Senate would complete his transformation from farm boy to American aristocrat. What he did to get it would become one of the most famous scandals in the history of Congress, and the shame of it would haunt his youngest daughter for the rest of her very long life. Chapter 2. The Senator Who Bought His Seat. William Clark spent $431,000 in cash bribes to become a United States Senator, and when he was caught, he simply bought his way back in. The year was 1899. Montana's state legislature held the power to elect senators in those days, before the 17th Amendment transferred the vote to the people. Clark wanted the seat with a hunger that bordered on obsession. He had already lost once, in 1893, outmaneuvered by his rival Marcus Daly and the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. The defeat humiliated him. Clark was not a man who lost gracefully, so he tried again. This time, he brought cash. His agents fanned out across Montana. Envelopes appeared in legislators' hotel rooms. Payments of $5,000, $10,000, even $15,000 found their way into the hands of men who suddenly developed a fondness for William Clark's candidacy. The operation was brazen. In a state where a miner's annual wage was $800, Clark was handing out sums that could buy a ranch. He won the vote. He traveled to Washington. He took his seat. Then the scandal broke. A grand jury investigation revealed the payments. Witnesses testified. Bank records were examined. One legislator admitted that $30,000 had been delivered to his room in a sealed envelope. The total spent on bribes, documented in committee proceedings, reached $431,000. Adjusted for today's currency, that figure exceeds $15 million. Clark had spent a fortune to acquire a position that paid $5,000 a year. The purchase was never about the salary. It was about the title. Mark Twain, never one to miss an opportunity for contempt, delivered a verdict that has endured for more than a century. He called Clark the most disgusting creature the Republic had produced since the days of Boss Tweed. The language was savage, the intent precise. Twain saw in Clark the perfect embodiment of a system in which money could buy not just comfort, but legitimacy. Clark, for his part, never publicly responded. The Senate voted to expel him. Clark resigned one day before the vote, preserving a technicality. Then, in a move of breathtaking audacity, he ran again. This time, Daly was dead. The opposition collapsed. In 1901, Clark was seated without scandal. He served one full term, accomplished nothing of note, and retired to build monuments to himself. But the bribery affair did more than stain his reputation. It helped fuel the movement that produced the 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, which gave the people the direct election of senators. Clark's corruption had, in its way, reformed the Republic, and there was a private scandal running alongside the public one. In 1901, the same year Clark returned to the Senate, he secretly married Anna LaChapelle. She was 23. He was 62. She had been his ward, a young woman from Butte whom he had supported and educated since she was a teenager. The nature of their earlier relationship remains unclear, but the marriage was hidden from Clark's adult children from his first wife for years. The couple lived in Paris, far from Montana gossip. In Paris, 2 daughters were born. The first, Louise Amelia André, called André, arrived in 1902. The second, Huguette Marcel, arrived on June 9, 1906. Clark was 67 years old. He was building a palace on Fifth Avenue. He was fighting lawsuits and political enemies. And he had just become the father of a baby girl who would outlive everyone he had ever known. Clark adored Huguette. He also warned her. The exact words have been reported in multiple accounts, though no one can say precisely when he spoke them. No one will really love you. You have to be careful. It was the lesson of a man who had bought everything, including a Senate seat, and who understood the price of living in a world where every relationship was shadowed by money. Whether it was wisdom or a curse depended entirely on how the listener carried it forward. Huguette carried it for 100 years. Chapter 3. 121 rooms for a family of 4. William Clark purchased an entire quarry and built a railroad just to supply stone for a house that architectural critics immediately called the most vulgar residence in New York. The mansion rose at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 77th Street, on what was then known as Millionaire's Row. Construction began in 1895. It would take 14 years and $7 million to complete. That figure in today's money approaches $200 million. Clark did not merely build a house. He constructed an argument. Every room, every panel, every gilded flourish was a sentence in the same declaration. I have arrived, and I dare you to ignore me. The house contained 121 rooms. A grand salon featured gold leaf walls imported from a French chateau. The music room held a pipe organ with 4,000 pipes. Oak panels had been stripped from Sherwood Forest. Marble came from quarries Clark purchased specifically for the project. A private railroad carried the stone from the quarry to the site. The art gallery held paintings by Corot, Degas, and Cazin. There were reception rooms and breakfast rooms and drawing rooms and servants' quarters stacked 4 floors high. It occupied an entire city block. The critics were merciless. The press called it Clark's Folly. Architects dismissed it as a monument to bad taste, a jumble of competing styles with no coherent vision. One reviewer compared it to a department store. Another said it looked like every palace in Europe had been put through a blender and poured onto Fifth Avenue. Clark did not care. He had not built the house for critics. He had built it for himself and for the family that would carry his name into the next century. That family was small and growing smaller. Clark's first wife, Kate, had died in 1893. His adult children from that marriage were spread across the country and deeply suspicious of Anna, the young second wife. The household at 77th Street was, for all its 121 rooms, a family of 4: William, Anna, André, and Huguette. 4 people in a space designed to hold a court. But on the other side of the continent, there was another world entirely. In Santa Barbara, California, on a bluff above the Pacific Ocean, the Clarks maintained an estate called Bello Sguardo. The name means beautiful lookout in Italian, and the description was literal. The property spread across 23 acres of coastal hilltop, with views stretching from the Channel Islands to the mountains behind the city. The main house was modest by Clark standards, only 27 rooms, but the grounds were paradise. Gardens terraced down toward the sea. Citrus trees lined the paths. The light was the golden, saturated light of the Southern California coast, and it poured through the windows of a studio where young Huguette learned to paint. These were the good years. Huguette and André swam in the Pacific. They played music together. Huguette studied the violin, and the family owned not one, but 3 Stradivarius instruments. Anna painted watercolors. William, aging but still fierce, presided over it all like a copper king, surveying his domain from a cliff-top throne. Huguette would later describe these years in the soft, careful language of someone handling something fragile. She painted scenes of Bellosguardo from memory, decades after she stopped visiting. She painted her sister. She painted the gardens. She painted the Japanese dolls that her mother collected. She held on to the light the way a person holds on to water, tightly, knowing it will slip through. But light fades. William Clark was in his 80s. His body was failing, though his will remained iron. André, the older sister, the lively one, the one who anchored Huguette to the social world, was about to disappear forever. And the greatest house on Fifth Avenue, that 121-room monument to ambition and arrival, had less than 20 years to live. The Clark family stood at the summit. Behind them lay log cabins and copper mines and Senate scandals. Before them lay something none of them expected. The mountain was about to crack, and Huguette Clark, 9 years old, painting in the California sun, had no idea that she was already living in the last good chapter of her life. But Chapter 4, The Sister Who Never Grew Old. André Clark was 16 years old and 1 week from her 17th birthday when meningitis killed her, and Huguette spent the next 92 years refusing to let her go. It happened in the autumn of 1919. The world was still reeling from the influenza pandemic that had killed tens of millions. André fell ill at the family's home in New York. The diagnosis was bacterial meningitis. In an era before antibiotics, the disease moved fast and offered no mercy. Within days, the girl who had been Huguette's closest companion, her only sibling in the household, the one person who shared the strange gravity of being William Clark's daughter, was dead. Huguette was 13. She had spent her entire conscious life in her sister's orbit. They spoke French together. They played duets. They explored the gardens at Bellosguardo. Now the other half of her world had simply vanished, replaced by a silence that would never fully lift. The family responded as wealthy families of that era did, with monuments. William Clark commissioned the construction of a bird refuge in Santa Barbara, a small, elegant sanctuary on a coastal lagoon. It was named the André Clark Bird Refuge, and it stands to this day, a green and quiet place where herons wade through shallow water and tourists pause to read the dedication plaque without knowing anything about the girl it honors. On the Bellosguardo estate, a cottage was renamed André's Cottage. Paintings were commissioned showing André as she might have looked had she lived. At 20, at 30, aging gracefully in an imaginary future that meningitis had stolen. Huguette kept these paintings for the rest of her life. She kept photographs. She kept memories polished to a brightness that real life could never match. André became, in Huguette's private mythology, a figure frozen in amber, forever young, forever kind, forever the sister who would have understood. It is one of the quieter tragedies of Huguette's story that the person she trusted most died before either of them had learned how complicated trust becomes. The grief reshaped the family. Anna, already reserved, drew closer to her surviving daughter. William, now in his 80s, threw himself into his final projects with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun his own mortality. The household became smaller, quieter, and more enclosed. The social obligations of a Copper King's family continued, but the joy had drained out of them. Huguette, a teenager who should have been attending dances and exploring the city, instead turned further inward toward her painting, her music, and the company of a mother who understood grief as well as she did. 6 years later, William Andrews Clark followed his daughter into the grave. He died on March 2nd, 1925, at the age of 86. His body was prepared and laid in the grand salon of the Fifth Avenue mansion. The funeral was a spectacle worthy of the man. Mourners filed through the 121 rooms. The pipe organ, with its 4,000 pipes, played. The gold leaf walls gleamed under electric light, the very current that had made Clark's fortune. Outside, on Fifth Avenue, the city that Clark had tried to impress with his palace barely paused. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, in a mausoleum he had commissioned himself, a granite monument to family permanence. What happened next would have been unthinkable to the man who built it. Clark's heirs from his first marriage had no use for the house. They saw it as an extravagance and a liability. Anna and Huguette did not want it either. The 121 rooms were too many for a mother and daughter who preferred their quieter apartments. The mansion was offered for sale. There were no buyers. The maintenance costs were crushing. In 1927, just 2 years after Clark's death, the wrecking crews arrived. The palace was demolished. The site was cleared. Apartment buildings rose in its place. The gold salon, the pipe organ, the Sherwood Forest oak, all of it gone. $7 million in construction, erased in a matter of months. The demolition was not unique. All along Fifth Avenue, the great Gilded Age mansions were falling. The Vanderbilt houses, the Astor houses, the Whitney mansion, one after another, surrendered to the wrecking ball. The Frick mansion survived only because Henry Clay Frick had the foresight to leave it to the public as a museum. Everyone else's monument went down. The economics were simple and brutal. Land in Manhattan was worth more than the buildings on it. The palaces of the robber barons were torn down to make way for the apartment towers of the Jazz Age. Millionaires' Row ceased to exist. William Clark's monument to permanence lasted barely a generation. For Huguette, the demolition was another disappearance. The house where her father had lived, where his funeral had been held, where the scale of the Clark fortune had been made physically manifest, was now rubble. The pattern was forming. First André, then her father, then the house itself. The things she loved kept vanishing. She was 19 years old, and she had already learned that nothing stays. And then she tried, briefly and disastrously, to build a life of her own. In 1928, Huguette married William MacDonald Gower, a law student and aspiring politician from a socially prominent family. She was 22. He was 24. The circumstances were, by any measure, strange. Accounts differ on the details, but the broad strokes are consistent. The marriage may have been arranged, or at least heavily encouraged, by Anna, who worried about her daughter's increasing isolation. A young woman of Huguette's wealth and background was expected to marry. The unmarried daughter of a disgraced senator was a social problem that required a social solution. There were allegations that Gower received a substantial financial incentive to marry Huguette, with some sources citing a figure of $1 million. Whether that specific number is accurate or inflated matters less than what it represents. The suspicion that even Huguette's most intimate relationship was, at its root, a financial transaction. What is not disputed is that the marriage was brief, and by all available evidence, never consummated. The couple lived together in a manner that suggested obligation rather than affection. Gower attended social events. Huguette did not. The gap between them widened until it became the entire landscape of the relationship. They divorced in Reno, Nevada, in 1930, after less than 2 years. Huguette arrived at the courthouse with 6 servants. A photographer captured her on the steps, and this image became the last known photograph of Huguette Clark taken in a public setting. She was 24 years old. She would live another 81 years. No camera would find her again. The divorce confirmed everything her father had warned her about. No one will really love you. You have to be careful. She had tried. She had failed. She had been, perhaps, used. And now the walls began to close, slowly at first, then with the grinding inevitability of a door that has found its groove. Huguette retreated to her mother's side. Together, they occupied a series of apartments on Fifth Avenue and the estate at Bello Sguardo and a property in Connecticut. The world outside grew louder. The Depression came. The Second World War came. The 20th century roared forward, and Huguette Clark, painting quietly in her room, playing her Stradivarius for no audience, began the long process of leaving without ever walking out the door. Chapter 5. The 50-Year Command. Huguette gave 2 instructions after her mother died, and 40 servants obeyed them without question for half a century. Anna Clark passed away on October 11th, 1963. She was 96 years old. She had been Huguette's anchor, her companion, her shield against a world that Huguette had stopped trusting decades earlier. The 2 women had lived together in adjacent apartments on Fifth Avenue, a mother and daughter enclosed in a private universe of painting, music, and careful silence. They spoke French together, as they always had. They discussed art. They ate quiet meals. The rest of humanity existed somewhere beyond the walls, and neither of them showed any interest in opening the door. When Anna died, the last thread connecting Huguette to ordinary human life snapped. She was 57 years old. She had not been photographed in public in 33 years. She had no husband, no children, no close friends outside a tiny circle of employees and associates. Her mother had been the final person on earth who loved her without the complication of money. Now, even that was gone. Huguette's instructions were simple. She told her staff, "Keep everything in first-class condition. Change nothing." These 2 sentences became a kind of holy writ, an order that would be executed with religious precision across 3 properties, 2 coasts, and 5 decades. The cost would be measured in tens of millions of dollars. The purpose would remain a mystery. Begin with Bello Sguardo. The estate in Santa Barbara sat on its hilltop above the Pacific. 23 acres of gardens, orchards, and ocean views, anchored by a 27-room main house and a carriage house with a full complement of automobiles. After Anna's death, Huguette stopped visiting. She simply stopped. She did not sell the property. She did not sell the property. She did not close it. She did not explain. She just never came back. But the staff remained. Groundskeepers tended the gardens as if the family might arrive any afternoon. Books in the library were rotated on their shelves to prevent the spines from fading unevenly in the sunlight. Custom fabric covers were sewn for every piece of furniture. The automobiles in the carriage house sat in perfect rows, their 1949 license plates gathering the thinnest film of dust. A small house that had been built for the family dog was left standing, undisturbed, decades after the dog had died. The swimming pool was maintained. The tennis court was maintained. The citrus trees were pruned, harvested, and the fruit was given away or left to fall. The monthly cost of maintaining Belo Guardo reached $40,000. Over the decades, the total would climb to $24 million. $24 million to preserve a house that its owner would never enter again. Fresh flowers appeared in rooms that received no visitors. Light bulbs were replaced in fixtures that illuminated nothing but empty hallways. The estate existed in a state of perpetual readiness, like a theater set for a play whose star had permanently retired. Now crossed the continent to Manhattan. Huguette's Fifth Avenue apartments occupied 42 rooms across multiple floors. Inside, the collection was staggering. Paintings by Monet and Renoir hung on the walls. 3 Stradivarius violins rested in their cases. And then there were the dolls. Huguette Clark loved dolls. Not as a childish affection, but with the focused intensity of a collector and an artist. She commissioned miniature furniture, tiny silverware, doll-sized gowns stitched by hand. She maintained Japanese friendship dolls. She spent thousands of dollars on individual pieces for elaborate dollhouse interiors. The apartments held room after room of these creations, a parallel world at 1/12 scale, immaculate and silent. Her personal assistant, Chris Sattler, maintained the apartments for years. He reported to an owner he almost never saw. Huguette lived 6 blocks away, but she might as well have been on the moon. She communicated by telephone. She gave instructions. She asked about the dolls. The Monets stayed on the walls. The Stradivari stayed in their cases. The flowers were refreshed. The rooms were cleaned. The building cost alone, in co-op fees and maintenance, for $100 million worth of Manhattan real estate, ran into the hundreds of thousands per year. And then there was Connecticut. The Le Beau Chateau estate in New Canaan had been purchased by the Clarks, but never truly occupied by Huguette. The house sat, largely unfurnished, on 52 acres of woodland. When the property was eventually examined, the safe was found to contain nothing but architectural plans for rooms that had never been built out. The estate was a ghost before it ever had a chance to live. It would eventually sell for $14.3 million to a buyer who had never heard of Huguette Clark. There was one more detail that captured the nature of Huguette's relationship with her properties and with the outside world. At some point during her decades of seclusion, Huguette learned that an aerial photograph of Belo Guardo had been printed as a postcard and was being sold in Santa Barbara gift shops. The idea that strangers could look down on her estate, could see the layout of her grounds and the shape of her private world, sent her into something close to panic. She instructed her staff to buy every copy of the postcard they could find. Thousands were purchased and destroyed. The woman who refused to visit Belo Guardo could not bear the thought of anyone else seeing it. Step back and absorb the full picture. 3 properties on 2 coasts, 40 servants, from groundskeepers in Santa Barbara to doormen in Manhattan. Annual maintenance costs approaching $1 million per year, $100 million in Manhattan real estate, $24 million spent on Belo Guardo alone over the decades, $14.3 million for a Connecticut house never slept in, cars with 1949 plates, a dead dog's house, books rotated against sunlight in a library no one read in, thousands of postcards purchased to prevent strangers from glimpsing an estate their owner would never visit, and one woman, alone in an apartment, then a hospital room, writing checks to keep it all alive. This was not madness Or if it was the most orderly madness in the history of American wealth. Huguette was not hoarding. She was not confused. She was maintaining. She had taken her mother's world, the world they had shared, and placed it under glass. Change nothing. Keep it in first-class condition. The instruction was not about the houses. It was about the past. If the houses stayed the same, then the past stayed the same. And if the past stayed the same, then Anna was still alive, and André was still alive, and Huguette was still a girl painting in the California light. The flowers kept coming, the bills kept coming, and Huguette kept not coming. She had found a way to be present in 3 magnificent homes without ever being present in any of them. She had purchased not a life, but the museum of one. Chapter 6. The woman who looked like a homeless person. When one of the wealthiest women in America finally saw a doctor after 20 years, the nurses wrote in her chart that she looked like a homeless person. The date was sometime in 1991. Huguette Clark was 85 years old. She had been living in her Fifth Avenue apartment, largely alone, attended by a small staff, but seeing almost no one. She had developed skin cancers on her face, the kind that grow slowly and disfigure gradually if left untreated. She had ignored them for years. She had also lost weight, eating little, moving less, her body shrinking inside layers of clothing. When she was finally brought to Doctor's Hospital, a small, now closed facility on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the intake staff recorded what they saw. She weighed 85 pounds. She wore a housecoat layered beneath 3 cashmere sweaters. Her face bore the visible marks of untreated basal cell carcinomas. The nurse's note was clinical but devastating. Her appearance resembled that of a homeless person. Consider the arithmetic of that sentence. A woman with a net worth exceeding $300 million. A woman who owned 42 rooms on Fifth Avenue, 23 acres in Santa Barbara, and 52 acres in Connecticut. A woman whose father had built the largest private residence in New York City. And the word the medical professionals reached for was homeless. It is the most perfectly ironic detail in a story filled with them. Huguette Clark had more homes than almost anyone in America. She lived in none of them. And the hospital staff, not knowing who she was, saw a frail, elderly woman who appeared to have nowhere to go. She stayed. The doctors treated her cancers. They addressed her malnutrition. They expected a recovery and a discharge. Neither came. Huguette found in Doctor's Hospital something she had not found anywhere else. A controlled, predictable, perfectly bounded world. The room was small. The staff was attentive. The routine was fixed. No one asked her to attend parties. No one asked her for money. No one knew who she was. She registered under the name Harriet Chase. She requested a fake room number for her records. She asked that no visitors be admitted without her explicit approval, which she almost never gave. She paid out of pocket, refusing to use insurance, at a rate that would eventually exceed $800 per day. The hospital was delighted to have a permanent paying guest, and Huguette was delighted to have found, at last, the smallest room she could control completely. The days took on a pattern. She woke early. She watched television, primarily cartoons and old films. The Flintstones were a particular favorite, along with the Smurfs. She paged through catalogs, especially those featuring dolls and miniature furniture. She spoke on the telephone with her attorney, her accountant, and occasionally with a small circle of people she trusted. She painted. Even in the hospital, she continued to work in watercolors, producing careful, delicate images that suggested a trained eye and a patient hand. At night, private duty nurses attended her around the clock. The nurses became her primary human contact. The people who saw her face, heard her voice, witnessed her daily existence. They adjusted her pillows. They brought her meals. They sat with her through the long hours of a night that, for Huguette Clark, had been going on for decades. She was not miserable. This is the part that confounds people. Visitors expected to find depression, decay, the symptoms of a mind in collapse. What the nurses reported was something different. Huguette was alert. She was interested in things. She asked questions about her nurses' families. She followed current events, at least casually. She remembered birthdays. She had opinions about the cartoons she watched and the catalog she studied. She was, by all accounts, a person who had chosen her circumstances and was, in her own way, content within them. But contentment built on isolation has a particular fragility. The world outside the hospital room continued to change. Manhattan transformed itself around her. Presidents came and went. Wars began and ended. The internet was invented, spread, and remade human communication. Huguette noticed none of it. Or rather, she noticed only the parts that reached her through the television and the telephone, filtered through a screen of deliberate disengagement that she had spent a lifetime perfecting. 7,364 nights. That is how long Huguette Clark lived in that hospital. 20 years and 86 days. She occupied the same room, in the same building, under the same false name, paying the same daily rate, while her 3 homes sat empty and her 40 servants continued their work, and her paintings hung unseen, and her Stradivarii went unplayed. The cost of the hospital stay alone would eventually exceed $6 million. Added to the maintenance of Bello Sguardo, the upkeep of the apartments, the property taxes, the staff salaries, the insurance, the legal fees, and the gifts she continued to make, the monthly outflow from Huguette Clark's fortune was a river of money flowing steadily toward a sea of absence. When Doctors Hospital closed, she was transferred to Beth Israel Medical Center, where she continued her vigil. The move was handled with the care of a state operation. A reclusive woman who had not left her room voluntarily in years had to be transported across the city, along with her paintings, her catalogs, her small collection of possessions. The new room was different. The routine was the same. She had made her choice, and the choice had hardened into a life, or rather, into the precise opposite of a life. A stasis, a preservation, a woman in a hospital bed, watching the Flintstones, surrounded by doll catalogs, while somewhere in California the sun set over Bello Sguardo, and the gardeners finished their work, and the lights came on in rooms that existed for no one. Huguette Clark had crossed the point of no return. She was not going home. She had no home in the sense that most people understand the word. She had properties. She had addresses. She had 42 rooms full of Monets and Stradivari and doll furniture. But home is where you choose to be, and Huguette had chosen a hospital room with a fake name and a television playing cartoons. The mansions waited. They would wait for a very long time. And the woman who owned them was about to begin giving away the fortune that sustained them, one astonishing gift at a time. Chapter 7. $31 million for a nurse. Hadassah Perry worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week for 20 years, and in return Huguette gave her 5 houses, a Bentley, and a Stradivarius violin. Perry was a private duty nurse from the Philippines who had come to the United States seeking opportunity. She found it in the most unlikely of places, the hospital room of a reclusive centenarian. She became Huguette's primary caretaker, her daily companion, and, depending on whom you believe, either the most dedicated nurse in America or the most successful opportunist. The gifts began modestly: small bonuses, holiday presents, gestures of appreciation from a patient to the person who brought her meals and adjusted her blankets. But Huguette's idea of a small gesture existed on a scale that most people cannot imagine. The bonuses grew, the presents multiplied, and over 20 years the trickle became a flood. 5 houses, not apartments, houses purchased in Perry's name or in the names of her family members, in Brooklyn and Connecticut. A Bentley automobile because Huguette noticed that Perry's car was old. A Stradivarius violin because Huguette remembered that Perry had once mentioned her son played. The violin alone was worth millions. It had been in the Clark family for generations. Huguette gave it away because a boy she had never met liked to play. The total gifts to Hadassah Perry reached $31 million. But Perry was not the only recipient of Huguette's generosity. Suzanne Pierre, described as Huguette's best friend and goddaughter, received approximately $10 million. Huguette's attorney, Wallace Bach, received $1.5 million, some of it earmarked for the construction of a bomb shelter at his home. Doctors at the hospital received gifts. The hospital itself received donations. One doctor reportedly received $20,000 for the painting of his house. Not a painting in the artistic sense. The actual painting of the exterior of his home. The gifts revealed something essential about Huguette Clark. She had no language for love except money. She could not hug because no one was close enough. She could not visit because she had stopped going places. She could not share meals or take walks or sit in comfortable silence with another person because her world had contracted to a single hospital room. But she could write checks. And so she did, prolifically, desperately, in amounts that made her accountants wince and her future heirs furious. Was she exploited? The question haunted the final years of her life and dominated the legal battles that followed. Perry's defenders, including Perry herself, argued that the nurse had sacrificed her own family life, working punishing hours for 2 decades, becoming Huguette's only real human connection. Perry testified that she had missed her own children's milestones. She had worked through holidays. She had spent more time at Huguette's bedside than in her own home. The gifts, in this telling, were the wages of devotion. Not just payment, but acknowledgement. An elderly woman with no family had found someone willing to be present, and she had expressed her gratitude in the only language she knew. Perry's accusers saw something darker. They pointed to the escalating pattern of gifts, the isolation that ensured no one else could intervene, the convenient fact that Huguette's mental state was never independently assessed until the very end. They noted that the gifts increased as Huguette aged, as her world narrowed further, as her dependence on her nurse grew more absolute. They argued that Perry had positioned herself as gatekeeper, controlling access to a vulnerable woman and reaping the rewards of that control. In this version of the story, Perry was not a devoted nurse. She was a skilled practitioner of a very old profession. The extraction of wealth from the lonely. The truth, as is often the case, probably contained elements of both. Perry worked hard. Perry also benefited enormously. These two facts can coexist without resolving the moral question at their center. The hospital itself faced similar accusations. Beth Israel was alleged to have conducted a quiet campaign to extract donations from its wealthy permanent resident. The $20,000 check for a doctor's house painting was only one example. There were donations to hospital funds. There were contributions to programs and initiatives. There was the extraordinary courtesy extended to a patient who paid $800 a day, never complained, and asked for nothing but solitude and cartoons. Were they caring for Huguette or cultivating her? The line between attention and extraction can be very thin when the patient is worth $300 million and has no family member watching the accounts. But here is what made Huguette's case so unsettling to everyone who examined it. She was not confused. She was not demented. She was not, by any clinical measure, incapable of making her own decisions. She simply chose to express her entire emotional life through the writing of checks. She bought love the way her father had bought a Senate seat, directly, without apology, and with full knowledge of what she was doing. The difference was that Clark wanted power. Huguette wanted company, and both of them paid far more than the market rate. The $31 million given to Hadassah Perry was not a fortune transferred in a moment of weakness. It was a fortune transferred one gift at a time, over 20 years, by a woman who knew the value of everything and had decided that human connection, however purchased, was worth the price. Whether Perry earned it or extracted it may be a question without an answer, but the money was gone, and the reckoning was coming. Chapter 8. The Fortune That Ate Itself. Huguette Clark owed the IRS $82 million in unpaid gift taxes, and the bill was growing by $9,000 every single day. The math was elegant and merciless. Under federal law, gifts above a certain threshold are subject to a gift tax, payable by the giver. Huguette had been giving away millions of dollars for years. She had not been paying the tax. The IRS had been watching, or at least accumulating, and the interest and penalties were compounding with the indifferent precision of a clock. $82 million, $9,000 per day, that is $375 per hour, $6.25 per minute. While Huguette watched cartoons in her hospital room, while her servants tended the roses at Bellosguardo, while the Monets hung in the dark on Fifth Avenue, the tax debt was growing in real time, eating the fortune from the inside like a slow fire. The irony was crushing. Huguette had more than enough to pay the debt. Her assets totaled over $300 million. But nearly all of that wealth was locked in real estate and art, not liquid. She was, in the most American of paradoxes, simultaneously fabulously rich and functionally cash poor. She could not write a check for $82 million. She could barely cover her monthly bills. So the selling began. First came the Renoir. La Promenade, a luminous painting of a woman and child walking through dappled sunlight, had been purchased by William Clark for $125,000 at the turn of the century. It was one of the crown jewels of the collection, a work that had hung in the Fifth Avenue apartment for decades, seen by almost no one, appreciated only by the empty room that contained it. In 2003, Huguette authorized its sale through Christie's. It brought $23.5 million. One painting, bought for a fraction and sold for a fortune. It was the most visible evidence that the Clark collection, assembled over a century, was being liquidated to fund the present. The Renoir sale was a signal. Other pieces followed, works that William Clark had purchased in Paris at the turn of the century, paintings that had traveled across the Atlantic, that had hung first in the 121-room mansion and then in the Fifth Avenue apartments, were quietly placed on the market. Each sale generated cash. Each sale also generated the feeling of a great house being stripped for parts. Then came the jewelry. In 2012, Christie's held an auction of Huguette's pieces. The catalog read like an inventory of the Gilded Age itself. The star of the sale was a 9-carat pink diamond ring that had been a gift from her father. William Clark had given it to his youngest daughter as a token of the fortune she would inherit. The auction estimate was $3 to $5 million. Bidding pushed the final price to $15.7 million. The total jewelry auction brought $18.3 million, a sum that represented only a fraction of what Huguette had once owned, but was still enough to fund several years of her extraordinary expenses. These sales were stopgaps. They kept the lights on. They paid the hospital bills and the maintenance costs and the lawyers' fees. But they did not touch the tax debt, which continued its quiet, mathematical advance. The fortune was consuming itself in a vicious cycle, the gifts creating taxes, the taxes creating penalties, the penalties creating urgency, the urgency creating more sales, the sales reducing the assets that were supposed to fund the whole operation. It was a machine designed to eat itself, and Huguette had built it without meaning to, one generous check at a time. $306.5 million. That was the total value of Huguette's estate at the time of the accounting. $82 million in tax debt. $800 per day for the hospital room. $40,000 per month for Bellosguardo. Staff salaries, property taxes, insurance, legal fees, and $9,000 per day in penalties growing like coral on a reef, silent and relentless. The fortune that William Clark had built from log cabins and copper mines and Senate bribes was dissolving, not in a crash, but in a slow, methodical hemorrhage that no one had the authority or the inclination to stop. Huguette signed the checks. She authorized the sales. She did not argue. She did not complain. She was 100 years old, and she was watching her father's fortune shrink with the same detachment she had shown toward the houses she refused to visit. The money had always been an abstraction to her. It was large, it was there, and it belonged to a world she had left decades ago. If it was disappearing, well, so had everything else. Her sister, her father, the mansion on Fifth Avenue, her marriage, her youth. The money was simply the last thing in line. But the money's disappearance created a problem that Huguette's other losses had not. It created heirs. 19 of them, to be precise. The descendants of William Clark's first marriage. People who had never met Huguette, who had never entered her hospital room, who had never tended her gardens or adjusted her pillows or brought her doll catalogs. They had done nothing for her. But the law said they were family. And family, under American inheritance law, has expectations. The question of who would get what was about to become very complicated and very expensive. Chapter 9. 2 Wills and 6 Weeks. At 98 years old, Huguette signed 2 contradictory wills 6 weeks apart, and the second one erased her entire family. The first will was signed in April of 2005. It was a conventional document, the kind that estate attorneys draft as a matter of course. It distributed Huguette's assets among her relatives, the 19 descendants of William Clark's children from his first marriage. These were people Huguette had not seen in decades, if ever. She had no relationship with them, but they were blood, and the first will honored that bond with the blunt efficiency of default inheritance law. 6 weeks later, Huguette signed a second will. It was a different document entirely. The second will cut out all 19 relatives, every one of them. Instead, it directed the bulk of the estate to a new entity called the Bellosguardo Foundation, which would preserve the Santa Barbara estate as a public art center. it left substantial bequests to Hadassah Perry, to Suzanne Pierre, to Wallace Bach, and to several other individuals who had been part of Huguette's daily life. The family received nothing. The question that would consume lawyers, judges, and journalists for years was simple. Which will reflected Huguette's true wishes? Was the first will her genuine intention, overridden by people who had access and influence? Or was the second will the real one, the product of a lucid mind that simply did not care about relatives she had never known? The relatives believed they had been robbed. They hired attorneys. They challenged the second will on the grounds of undue influence, arguing that Perry, Bach, and the hospital had manipulated a frail, isolated old woman into rewriting her estate plan. The case was compelling on its surface. Here was a centenarian, living under a false name, seeing no one but her nurse and her lawyer, suddenly disinheriting her entire family in favor of the people who surrounded her. The narrative wrote itself. Vulnerable woman, predatory caretakers, stolen fortune. But the reality was more complicated than the narrative. These 19 relatives were not grieving family members who had been shut out by a scheming nurse. Most of them had never met Huguette. Several could not have identified her in a photograph. They were the descendants of William Clark's children from his first marriage, a family branch that had existed in parallel to Huguette's life without intersecting it. They had not visited her in the hospital. They had not called her on the telephone. They had not sent birthday cards or holiday gifts. Their claim to her fortune was based entirely on blood, not on relationship. But Huguette had anticipated this, or rather, her legal team had. In 2005, at the age of 99, Huguette was examined by a neurologist named Dr. Louise Klebanoff. The examination was thorough. Klebanoff tested Huguette's orientation, her memory, her reasoning, her ability to understand the nature and consequences of her decisions. She asked Huguette about her assets. She asked about her family. She asked whether Huguette understood what it meant to sign a will that excluded her relatives. The verdict was unambiguous. Huguette Clark was alert, oriented, and competent. She knew what she owned. She knew who her relatives were. She understood that she was cutting them out, and she had chosen to do so. The case moved toward trial. Depositions were taken. Documents were produced. The full financial picture of Huguette's final years emerged in uncomfortable detail. The gifts to Perry, the hospital bills, the tax debt, the selling of masterpieces to cover monthly expenses. The press covered the story with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Here was a tale that had everything: Gilded Age wealth, a mysterious recluse, a fortune under siege, and a cast of characters who seemed to have walked out of a Dickens novel. The relatives pressed their case. Perry's attorneys defended hers. The Bello-Sguardo Foundation waited quietly in the background, hoping to inherit an estate and a mission. On the eve of trial, a settlement was reached. The terms were complex but clear in their implications. The 19 relatives would receive $34.5 million divided among them. Each would walk away with approximately $1.8 million, a handsome sum for people who had never met the woman whose estate they were claiming. The Bello-Sguardo Foundation would receive the Santa Barbara estate and approximately $85 million in assets, enough to maintain and operate the property as a public arts center. Perry would return $5 million of her gifts, a fraction of the $31 million she had received. And $25 million would be consumed by legal fees, paid to the armies of lawyers who had spent years arguing over the wishes of a woman who had spent her life trying to be left alone. The Manhattan District Attorney opened an investigation into potential financial exploitation. It was closed without charges. No criminal case was ever brought. No one was found to have broken any law. The settlement stood. The money was distributed. The lawyers were paid. And the question at the heart of it all remained, officially and permanently, unanswered. Had Huguette Clark been manipulated? Or had she made her own decision, with full knowledge and clear intent, to give her money to the people who had actually been present in her life, rather than to relatives who existed only as names on a family tree? The neurologist said she was competent. The gifts were consistent over 20 years. The second will aligned with everything Huguette had said and done for decades. She did not want her father's descendants, the children of a marriage that had nothing to do with her, to inherit the fortune that she considered hers. She wanted Bellosguardo preserved. She wanted her nurse rewarded. She wanted her attorney compensated. And she wanted her family, the family she had never known, to receive exactly what they had given her: nothing. The verdict that disturbed everyone was the simplest one. Huguette Clark knew exactly what she was doing. She had always known. And the unsettling thing about a woman who chooses to vanish is that you cannot claim she was lost. Chapter 10. The time capsule opens its doors. In 2023, 70 years after Huguette's last visit, strangers paid $100 each to walk through her front door at Bellosguardo. The Bellosguardo Foundation had spent years preparing the estate for public access. The legal battles were settled. The property taxes were current. The gardens had been maintained, as always, by the same crew that had tended them in Huguette's absence. But now there was a new mission: opening the doors. The first public tours began in the summer of 2023. Visitors drove up the winding road to the hilltop, passed through the gates, and entered a world that had not changed in half a century. The experience was described over and over by the same word: time capsule. The 1949 license plates were still on the automobiles in the carriage house. The Steinway pianos sat in the music room, tuned and silent. In the dining room, the table was set as if guests were expected. The library held books whose spines had been rotated for decades by servants protecting them from uneven sunlight. And in Huguette's studio, 50 of her own paintings had been returned and hung on the walls. Watercolors of gardens and castles, and her sister, André. The work of a woman who had spent her life looking backward and painting what she saw. Tour guides explained the details that visitors might miss. The furniture covers, custom sewn to protect every chair and sofa. The precise arrangement of objects on shelves that had not been rearranged since the 1960s. The fact that California's Proposition 13, passed in 1978, had kept the property taxes on Bellosguardo artificially low for decades, freezing the assessed value near its 1975 level and saving the estate hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual taxes. Without that law, the cost of maintaining the empty estate might have overwhelmed even Huguette's fortune years earlier. Visitors walked through the rooms and felt something difficult to name. It was not the grandeur that affected them, though the property was beautiful. It was the absence. Every room was prepared for someone who was not there. Every chair was dusted, every surface polished, every window cleaned to catch the Pacific light. And in that preparation, in that meticulous readiness, was the outline of a woman who had chosen not to come. Doll-sized chairs sat beside adult chairs. Miniature tables held miniature settings. Huguette's love of the small and the perfect was everywhere, a parallel world nested inside the larger one, both of them empty. The dolls themselves had been removed, sold, or stored, but their furniture remained. It was as if the inhabitants of a tiny civilization had simply walked away, leaving their homes intact for archaeologists who would never understand what they were finding. Meanwhile, the other properties found their own fates. The Connecticut estate, Le Beau Chateau, was sold to a fashion designer who renovated it extensively and later relisted it. The Fifth Avenue apartments were absorbed back into Manhattan's luxury real estate market. Their Monets and Renoirs long since sold, their rooms repurposed for new owners who would never know that a woman once paid hundreds of thousands a year to keep them pristine while she lived 6 blocks away in a hospital. The Clark fortune, or what remained of it, had been distributed. The legal fees had been paid. The tax debt had been settled. The 40 servants were gone. The only thing that endured in its original form was Bello Sguardo, the beautiful lookout, now open to strangers for the first time in its history. Huguette would have hated it, or perhaps she would have understood. The estate she had paid to preserve for 50 years was finally being seen. The gardens she had tended by proxy were being walked by people who would never know the sound of her voice. The past she had tried to freeze was thawing, gently, in the California sun. Chapter 11. The Daughter Who Answered Her Father. William Clark built the largest house on Fifth Avenue to announce to the world that he had arrived, and his daughter spent her life and fortune making the opposite declaration. This is the mirror at the center of the Clark story. A father who craved visibility, a daughter who craved its absence, a mansion built to say, "Look at me," a hospital room chosen to say, "Look away." Both of them used money as the instrument. Both of them succeeded completely, and both of them ended up alone. Clark's Fifth Avenue palace was the loudest sentence ever spoken in the language of Gilded Age architecture. 121 rooms, gold leaf from France, oak from Sherwood Forest, a pipe organ that could be heard from the street. It was a building designed to be impossible to ignore, erected by a man who had been ignored for the first 24 years of his life and intended never to experience that feeling again. Huguette's hospital room was the quietest: a single bed, a television, a telephone, catalogs, watercolor paints, a fake name on the door. It was a space designed to be impossible to find, chosen by a woman who had been found, measured, courted, and used for her money since the day she was born, and who intended never to experience that feeling again. Father and daughter, builder and vanisher, the shout and the whisper. The same fortune funded both. There is a pattern in American dynastic wealth that historians have observed across centuries. The first generation builds, the second generation consolidates, the third generation disperses. The Vanderbilts followed it, the Astors followed it, the Carnegies, in their way, followed it. The Clarks compressed this arc into 2 people. William built with the ferocity of a man who had known poverty. Huguette did not consolidate or disperse. She simply withdrew, pulling the fortune behind her like a blanket, using it not to build or even to destroy, but to maintain a world exactly as it was the day she decided to stop living in it. The compression is what makes the story unusual. Most great American fortunes take 3 or 4 generations to move from creation to dissolution. The builder's children spend lavishly, but retain the core. The grandchildren begin the decline. The great-grandchildren sell the last painting and move to a suburb. The Clarks skipped the middle steps. William made the fortune. Huguette unmade the life the fortune was supposed to support, while keeping the fortune itself on a kind of life support, breathing but not alive. She told a story once, or rather, she referred to a favorite fable. It was about a cricket and a butterfly. The butterfly was beautiful and visible and admired. It lived a short, spectacular life in the sunlight. The cricket was dull and hidden and overlooked. It lived a long, quiet life in the shadow. Huguette identified with the cricket. She chose obscurity. She chose the long life in the dark. The fable was her answer to her father. He had built 121 rooms to be the butterfly. She had chosen a hospital room to be the cricket. He had told her that no one would really love her. She had agreed, and she had solved the problem by removing herself from the equation entirely. If no one could love her for herself, then she would give them nothing to love except the money. And the money she gave freely to nurses and friends and foundations, because the money was never the thing she valued. The money was the thing everyone else valued. It was, in a sense, a decoy. While the world watched the fortune, Huguette disappeared. It worked. For 50 years, it worked. She was the cricket in the shadows, living past 100, painting her sister's face from memory, watching cartoons and signing checks. The butterfly's palace was demolished in 1927. The cricket's hospital room endured until 2011. In the end, the quiet outlasted the shout by more than 80 years. But the quiet was its own kind of desolation. A life lived in reaction to a warning is still a life shaped by the person who gave the warning. William Clark's shadow stretched across his daughter's entire century. She spent 100 years answering a question he had posed when she was a child. And the answer she arrived at was the loneliest one imaginable. "You were right, Father. No one will really love me, so I will love no one, and I will let the money stand in my place, and I will sit in a small room and wait for it to be over." Chapter 12. The beautiful lookout no one watched from. Bello Sguardo means beautiful lookout in Italian, and for 50 years its only purpose was to wait for someone who would never come to see the view. There is a cliff above the Pacific Ocean in Santa Barbara, where the light arrives each morning with a warmth that makes the air itself seem golden. On that cliff sits a house. It is not the largest house or the most famous, but it may be the saddest, because it was loved more than almost any building in America, and the person who loved it most refused to stand inside it. Huguette Clark was not insane. The neurologist confirmed it. The settlement confirmed it. Her own meticulous record-keeping confirmed it. She was a woman of clear mind and strong will who made a choice that the rest of the world found incomprehensible. She chose to leave, not by dying, not by traveling, but by sitting still in a small room and letting the money do the living for her. 40 servants maintained the illusion. 40 human beings went to work each day to polish silverware that no one would use, to arrange flowers that no one would smell, to mow lawns that no one would walk across, to tune pianos that no one would play. They were the employees of an absence. Their job was to keep everything ready for a moment that would never arrive. And yet there was something in that maintenance that went beyond futility. The servants did their work carefully. The gardens grew. The pianos stayed in tune. The books were turned. The houses in their emptiness achieved a strange and fragile beauty. The beauty of a place that has been loved so thoroughly that even neglect cannot touch it. Huguette did not neglect her properties. She lavished attention on them from a distance through intermediaries, with checks and phone calls and standing orders. She was the most devoted absentee in the history of American real estate. What does her life reveal? The question has no clean answer, which is perhaps the point. She inherited a fortune built on copper and corruption and a father's bottomless hunger for recognition. She watched that fortune demolish its own monuments. She lost her sister, her father, his palace, her marriage, and finally her mother, each loss sealing another door. And then she sat in a room and let the money run. The money ran for 50 years. It maintained 3 homes. It employed 40 people. It bought 5 houses for a nurse and a Stradivarius for a boy she never met. It paid $800 a day for a hospital room. It generated $82 million in tax debt. It funded lawsuits and settlements and legal fees. And when it was finally counted, divided, and distributed, it left behind a single estate on a cliff in California, its doors now open, its gardens still tended, its rooms still empty in all the ways that matter. Huguette Clark was buried before dawn on May 26, 2011, at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Her instructions specified no funeral, no service, no ceremony, no crowd. The mausoleum where she rests was built by her father a century ago, a granite monument inscribed with the Clark name, designed to declare the family's permanence to anyone who passed. Inside, William Clark's copper fortune is represented by nothing more than silence and stone. The man who bought a Senate seat and the daughter who bought a disappearance lie together in the dark. Bellosguardo stands on its cliff above the Pacific. Its doors are open now. Strangers walk through the rooms. They marvel at the license plates from 1949 and the Steinway pianos and the doll-sized furniture. They stand at the windows and look out at the view that gives the estate its name, the beautiful lookout, the place built to see the world from above. But the woman it waited for is gone. She was always already gone. She had chosen the hospital over the hilltop, the cricket over the butterfly, the small room over the 121. She had answered her father's warning with a life that proved him right. No one will really love you. You have to be careful. She was careful. She was so careful that she vanished. And in her vanishing, she left behind the most expensive haunted house in America. Not haunted by a ghost, but by the living woman who refused to come home. The flowers are still fresh at Bellosguardo. The gardens are still tended. The view is still beautiful. And somewhere in all that beauty, in all that silence, in all that perfectly maintained emptiness, is the answer to a question no one quite knows how to ask. What does it mean to own everything and choose nothing? What does it cost to disappear? Huguette Clark paid $40,000 a month to find out. The house is still waiting for her answer.